Humanity has always invented cruel and barbaric ways to hurt one another through torture. Here are barbaric and sadistic ways to torture people. Watch. The breast ripper. This nasty torture method was invented just for women. This instrument was designed to rip the breasts from a woman and was made from iron, which was usually heated. The hot claws would be imposed onto a single breast of the victim, left for a minute as the molten hot claw melted into the flesh like a hot knife through butter. Then the executioner would tighten his grip on the device and tear away at the flesh. This was a very close and personal way to torture your victim. If the woman didn't die, she would be horribly disfigured for the rest of her life. The Ripper would be unleashed upon you if you committed adultery or had an abortion. The Al-Kanza Brigade has adopted this instrument in their quest to impose strict Sharia law on women, even to this day, in the ISIS capital of Raqqa, Syria. The crocodile shears. This device was used in the late medieval Europe just for men. The shears were made of metal and worked like pincers or scissors, depending on the blade design. After being heated, the shears were applied to either the tongue or an erect penis, which was either sliced or torn away. The shears would be unleashed upon you if you tried to assassinate the king or committed treason. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel was a torture method used for public executions through the Middle Ages and into the modern times, by breaking a criminal's bones by bludgeoning them to death with a large hammer. If you were to be broken by the wheel, you'd be taken to a public stage or a platform, so everyone could see you. The victim would be tied to a large wagon or cartwheel. The executioner would start from the feet and work his way up by breaking every single bone in your body. The second part of this torture was called braiding. The executioner would braid the victim's broken arms and legs into the wheel and tie it down. Then he would be left on a high pole to suffer. If death hadn't happened by now, the birds would eat at the exposed flesh by the sharp protruding smashed bones. In 1348, during the time of the Black Death, a Jewish man named Bona Diaz underwent this punishment. The authorities stated he remained conscious for 4 days and 4 nights before dying, having been deliberately kept alive with strong drink. The wheel was used in Holy Roman Empire for committing murder. The Spanish donkey. This torture was often used by the Spanish Inquisition during the late Middle Ages. The victim would be made to sit naked on a wooden triangular-shaped device. Weights were tied onto his or her legs to increase agony and prevent falling off. According to historical sources, the wedge sometimes sliced right through the vic as a result of too much weight being attached to the legs. Victims would bleed and shit all over the wooden donkey, and it was never washed. So, if death didn't occur, infection would kill you. You'd find yourself sitting on the Spanish donkey if you was a witch, or committed adultery, or if you was a prisoner of war. The brazen bull. The brazen bull, or the bronze bull, was a torture and execution device designed in ancient Greece. According to the story, Perilios of Athens invented and showed it to Phalaris, the tyrant of Sicily, as a new means of executing criminals. The original bull was made entirely out of bronze, hollow with a door on one side. According to the legends, the brazen bull was designed in the form of the size of an actual bull, and had an acoustic apparatus that converted screams into the sound of a bull. First, the prisoner's tongue was cut off, then was locked inside the device, and a fire was lit under the belly, heating the metal until the person inside was roasted to death. The head of the bull was designed with a system of tubes and valves, which would sound like the bellows of a bull when the condemned were screaming into it. After construction had finished, Perilios is believed he would be rewarded for his invention. Instead, Phalaris, who was disgusted by the bull, ordered the sound system to be tested by its creator.
Come on!
tricking him into getting into the bull. As he entered it, it was immediately locked and a fire was lit so Phalaris could hear the inventor's screams. After freeing him from the bull, Phalaris had him executed. Ironically, Phalaris died by the bull. Saw torture. This horrible torture indicates the act of sawing a living person in half. Before the saw was used to slice through wood and thick materials, it was used to slice through humans for torture or execution. The victim would be held upside down, allowing the blood to rush to the head, and then the torture would slowly start, slicing them between their legs. Imagine that. Close your eyes for a second. You're hanging upside down. Your hands are tied behind your back and your legs are spread apart, tied to two posts. You are completely naked. The people around you are shouting and screaming for blood. They've come to see a show, and by God, this will be a show they will remember. Imagine seeing that rusty, bloodied saw and knowing that you will be feeling every single thrust and jagged edge from that saw as it rips you apart from your scrotum to your head. Fucked up, innit? With the blood contained in your head, the victim would remain conscious throughout most of the sawing, only passing out or dying when the saw hit their midsection. The Judas Cradle. The Judas Cradle, also known as the Judas Chair, was a tall, stool-shaped torture device with a metal or wooden pyramid on the top, used by the Spanish Inquisition. The victim would be stripped, bound with ropes and suspended above the device. They would be lowered, usually very slowly, onto the device, making the pyramid enter the vagina, anus or scrotum. The amount of pain the device inflicted could be changed in several ways. They could be rocked up and down onto the point repeatedly. One leg could be lifted. Olive oil could be poured onto the pyramid, or brass weights could be hung from the victim's legs, impaling them. Sometimes, to prolong the torture, the victim would be suspended over the device all night, and the torture would commence first thing in the morning. The device was never washed, so if the victim didn't die, the infection would kill them shortly after. Torture with the Judas Cradle could last several hours, up to several days. The Judas Cradle was unrelentless in causing pain. Victims would clench their muscles in their bodies to try to stop the pyramid from stretching them, which means they couldn't sleep. And if the executioner oiled the pyramid, then the victim wouldn't be able to stop the point from inflicting bodily damage. The cradle would be used to cause pain on the victim until the information needed was given. Sometimes the victim would say anything to stop the pain. Impalement. Impalement was the act of inserting a stake, pole, spear, or a hook into the anus and out the mouth. It was used in response to crimes against the state. This heinous torture was invented by Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad the Impaler. He was the Prince of Wallachia and was a feared monarch who ruled over the Romanian region of Transylvania by impaling his enemies. The unfortunate soul was placed on his belly, hands tied behind his back. A long, very sharp pole was produced, covered in grease, and inserted in the anus or vagina. Then the victim would be lifted off the ground and left to slowly slip bit by bit down the shaft, unable to stop it until it exited the body, either out the mouth or through the neck. Impaling was committed to strike fear into anyone who challenged the state or enemies from other countries. The pear of anguish. The pear was an extremely painful device used to punish women accused of causing a miscarriage, liars, blasphemers, or homosexuals. The pear-shaped instrument was inserted into the vagina for women, the anus for homosexuals, and the mouth for liars and blasphemers. Made of iron, the 4 leaves slowly opened as it was twisted, stretching the orifice until tearing occurred, or confession. Flaying. Being skinned alive, or flaying, is the act of stripping the skin from the body whilst alive. A sharp blade is used to make tears and remove the skin, either in little pieces or fully intact, depending on the requirement, exposing nerve and muscle tissue and leaving the victim in constant agony, assuming they even survive the ordeal at all. The saying goes, a naked man has few secrets, a flayed man has none. Executioners would wear their victims' skins as cloaks and display them within their chambers as a twisted hobby. Other methods were to severely burn the victim, then gradually peel off the skin. Flaying was used on captured soldiers and dangerous criminals. The head crusher. The head crusher was a metal frame device which had a plate that sat below the victim's jaw and was connected to a metal head cap. As the torturer slowly twisted the handle, the gap between the head and the plate decreased, crushing the skull, including the teeth, jaw, and the facial bones, ultimately inducing death. Even if the torturer stopped before death, permanent damage to the facial muscles and the jaw occurred. The victim's head would be slowly crushed, killing the victim, but not before the jaw had been smashed and the eyes pushed out their sockets. To worsen the pain, the torturer would tap on the head cap with a hammer, sending vibrations through the skull. All this with your hands tied behind your back. The knee splitter. The knee splitter was 2 wooden blocks placed on the knee, but later made from iron. It had 2 rows of spikes. The device was first used in 1530 in Germany. The blocks were connected by 2 large screws. When turned, the blocks would close towards each other, destroying the knee. The result would be permanent damage to the knees and leave the victim crippled for life. The blood eagle. The blood eagle is a ritualized method of execution used by the Vikings. The blood eagle is one of the most graphic, cruel, and slow torture methods ever described according to the 12th and 13th century scholars. The blood eagle had a long tradition in Scandinavia and was used against the most heinous enemies. First, an eagle was carved into the enemy's back, starting the process. Then, the back would be pried open, exposing the backbone and ribs. An axe was used to cut each of the ribs from the center of the backbone. Then, each rib would be snapped outwards, exposing the internal organs. Then, salt would be rubbed into the back to cause even more pain. Then, the lungs were removed as an offering to Odin, the All-Father of the Norse mythology. This would leave the victim looking like a mutilated eagle. They would then be hung up as a symbol. According to scholars, the blood eagle would be thrust upon you if you did something that made you honorless. Boiling alive. This method involved killing a person by being immersed in boiling liquid. Not as common as other methods of execution, boiling to death has been used in many parts of Europe and Asia. A large cauldron was used and filled with water, oil, or tar. A hook and ropes were used as a pulley system. The victim was lowered in, and the liquid would be heated until boiling. If the torturer wanted it to last, he would pull the victim up and down out of the liquid until he was boiled alive. The barrel roll. Personally, I think this is the worst form of torture ever created by humanity. This is the worst form of torture. A barrel was used filled with long sharp nails, and a child was lowered in and closed. His parents would be made to roll the barrel up and down until the child was ripped to shreds. The bamboo torture. Bamboo torture is a form of torture and execution where a bamboo shoot or shoots grow through the body of a victim. Reported to have been used in East and South Asia from the 1820s right up to the 1900s. This was the well-used method, but the victim would endure days, sometimes weeks of pain and discomfort. Being kept alive on purpose, cuts would be made and the bamboo shoots would be angled into them to grow. After World War II, stories circulated of Japanese soldiers inflicting the bamboo torture upon US and Allied POWs, where the victim was tied securely in place above young bamboo shoots. Over several days, the fast-growing shoots would first puncture, then completely penetrate the victim's body, eventually emerging through the other side. The cast of the popular TV program Mythbusters investigated the bamboo torture in a 2008 episode and found that the bamboo shoot can penetrate through several inches of ballistic gelatin in 3 days. For research purposes, ballistic gelatin is comparable to human flesh, and the experiment thus supported the viability of this form of torture. Bamboo is also one of the fastest growing plants in the world, and the hardest, as much as 3 feet in a single day. Other variations of the bamboo torture included sharpening sticks and inserting them behind fingernails and toenails. No one was safe from the bamboo torture technique. If questions were asked, men, women, and even children would be tortured in this fashion. Falling. Throwing or dropping people from great heights has been used as a form of execution since ancient times. People die in this way from injuries caused by hitting the ground at high speed. In pre-Roman Sardinia, elderly people who were unable to support themselves were ritually killed. First, they were intoxicated using a neurotoxin plant known as the sardonic herb. Then they were dropped from a high rock or beaten to death. Murderers and traitors, if convicted, were flung from a cliff to their deaths. Also, those who had mental or physical disabilities suffered the same fate, as they were thought to have been cursed by the gods. Later, during the Roman Empire, the Gemonian stairs were used for this purpose. The victims were bound and thrown down the stairs. Because their hands and feet were bound, they couldn't use their hands to break their falls, so heads would smash and necks would break on the marble. If the victim didn't die, he or she would be hoisted up and thrown down again and again, as many times as it took until they were dead. Crushed by elephants. Execution by elephant was a common method of capital punishment in South and Southeast Asia, particularly in India, where Asian elephants were used to crush, dismember, or torture captives in public executions. The animals were trained and versatile, able to kill victims immediately or to torture them slowly over a prolonged period. The sight of an elephant executing captives both horrified and attracted the interest of European travelers
and was recorded in numerous contemporary journals and accounts of life in Asia. Mostly used in Asia, the practice was passed to Western powers such as ancient Rome and Carthage. Elephants were trained to step on a lying-down victim's head, crushing it immediately. But to popularize the act, the elephant was trained to crush one leg, then the other, then one arm, then the other. The vic would be spread on the floor, tied down with a rope and rods. Crude metal blocks would be placed or fashioned onto the elephant's killing leg, so when it made contact with bone, it would smash it. After being left for hours in pain with broken arms and legs, the head would be last to go. Slow slicing. Ling Chi, translated as slow process, the lingering death or slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of torture and execution used in China from roughly 900 CE until it was banned in 1905. It was also used in Vietnam. For this torture, a knife was used to methodically remove portions of the body over an extended period of time, eventually resulting in death. The process involved tying the condemned prisoner to a wooden frame in a public place. The flesh was then cut from the body in multiple slices in a process not meant to kill quickly, but to prolong it. When a victim is cut to pieces, it means that the victim would not be whole in the afterlife. This method of execution became a fixture in the image of China amongst some Westerners. Ling Chi could be used on a living person or applied as an act of shame after death. It was meted out for major offences such as high treason, mass murder, or patricide or matricide, meaning the murder of one's master or employer. While difficult to obtain accurate details of how the executions took place, they generally consisted of cuts to the arms, legs and chest, leading up to fully amputating, followed by decapitation or stabbing to the heart. If the crime was less serious or the executioner felt merciful, the first cut would be to the throat, causing instant death. Disemboweling. Disembowelment or evisceration is the removal of some or all of the organs of the gastrointestinal tract, usually through a horizontal incision made across the abdominal area. Disembowelment may result from an accident, but has also been used as a method of torture and execution. If a living creature is disemboweled, it is invariably fatal without major medical intervention. Historically, disembowelment has been used as a severe form of capital punishment. If the intestinal tract alone is removed, death follows after several hours of gruesome pain. The victim will be often fully conscious while the torture is performed, if the vital organs aren't damaged, and will be able to see their intestines being removed, but will eventually lose consciousness due to blood loss. In Japan, disembowelment played a central part as a method of execution or the ritualized suicide of a samurai. In killing themselves by this method, they were deemed to be free from the dishonor resulting from their crimes. The most common form of disembowelment was referred to in Japanese as seppuku. Various accounts have asserted that during the Vietnam War, members of the Viet Cong sometimes made calculated use of disembowelment as a means of psychological warfare to coerce and intimidate rural peasants. In Romania, in the early 1941, during the Bucharest pogrom, in which 125 Jewish civilians were killed, multiple cases of torture, including disembowelment, were recorded. On the 10th of July in 1584 in the Netherlands, Balthar Gerard shot and killed William of Orange, who had advocated for Dutch independence from the King of Spain. The assassin was interrogated and condemned to death almost immediately on the 14th of July. After suffering various torturings during each of the 5 days since the assassination, Gerard was disemboweled and dismembered while still alive, after which his heart was torn out and then he was beheaded by his Dutch executioners. The rat torture. Torture is the use of rats to torture a victim by encouraging them to attack and eat the victim alive. During the Dutch Revolt, an ally of William the Silent is documented to have used a method where a pottery bowl is filled with rats and was placed open side down on a naked body of a prisoner. Then hot charcoal was piled on top of the bowl and the rats would gnaw into the very bowels of the victim in an attempt to escape the heat. Rat torture was used by several South American military dictatorships during the military regime of 1964 to 1985. The report of CONADEP in Argentina detailed the use of the torture method known as rectoscope, reserved primarily for Jewish prisoners, which consisted of inserting living rats into the victim's rectum or vagina through a tube. Humans have a long history of developing inventive ways to hurt each other. There's seemingly no end to the horrifying torture devices that people have conceived. But one of the most terrifying methods of torture ever created doesn't require a man-made device at all. Instead, it just requires a rat. Many people naturally feel a sense of fear and revulsion towards rats, and the animals will chew through nearly anything, including human flesh. And that makes them perfect tools for torture, especially if the torturer knew how to use them. The technique was far from the only way that rats were used as instruments of torture. Around the same of Pinochet's reign of terror in Chile, the military junta in control of Argentina devised a devilish innovation of the process. Instead of placing the rats against the flesh, the Argentines used a telescopic tube to guide the rats inside a prisoner's body through the rectum or vagina. My God, can you imagine that? Well, actually, don't imagine that. Of course, rat torture doesn't always need to be so complicated to be effective. The Tower of London had a room referred to as the Rat's Dungeon. The room was a pitch-black cell that sat underneath the waterline of the River Thames. As the river rose, rats swept up from its shores, would float in and begin to nibble at the flesh of the prisoners in the dungeon. This was almost certainly the most common way that rats had been used in torture. Prisoners were simply locked inside a confined space with a group of rats, in a small room with no way to avoid them. The prisoners would slowly be driven mad as the rats gnawed at their limbs, and in many ways, the fear that rat torture caused was more useful for the torturers than the pain. The idea of a rat eating into their guts or simply crawling over their limbs while they slept struck terror into the victims. And when a torturer is trying to get information from someone, that fear can often be more effective tool than physical pain. But the fear was also a good way to add a psychological element to the torture, when the goal was simply to inflict suffering. But ultimately, there are few specific documented cases of the rat torture being used. It might be that the idea of coaxing a rat to eat its way into someone's stomach was so horrible that even the most hardened sadist was reluctant to employ it. But alas, evidence still exists and can be found online and through the history books. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is a mythical torture and execution device consisting of an iron cabinet with a hinged front and spike-covered interior, sufficiently tall to enclose a human being. The Iron Maiden is a torture device widely believed to have been used in Europe during the Middle Ages. This notorious contraption is known by other names such as the Virgin, a reference to the Virgin Mary, and Jungfer, German for spinster. The Iron Maiden is described as being a human-sized box laden with spikes on the inside. A victim would be forced inside the Iron Maiden and would be impaled by the spikes when the torture device was shut. The earliest account that we have of the Iron Maiden dates to the 18th century and was written by historian John Philipp in a guidebook to the German city of Nuremberg. The historian claimed that a criminal was executed using an Iron Maiden in 1515. He also noted that the spikes inside the device were deliberately made in such a way that they were not long enough to kill him. Therefore, he continued suffering for 2 days before dying. At the same time as these supposed medieval torture devices were being created, more horror stories began to be attached to the Iron Maiden. One of these, for instance, states that the contraption was used during the Inquisition and that the Virgin's head was meant to symbolize the triumph of the Catholic Church over heresy. Another story claims the Iron Maiden was used as early as the 12th century. Imagine how that must have felt. Being locked inside a box, just like a coffin but standing up, and you'd be completely naked. Spikes would be poked into you when the door closed. You wouldn't be able to fall asleep because every time you fell asleep and leant to each side, spikes would be poked into you, all over your back, all over your front, into your face, and you wouldn't die. It would just cause great discomfort and pain. I wonder what devious mind that came from. The boots. The term boot refers to a family of instruments of torture and interrogation variously designed to cause crushing injuries to the foot and/or the leg. The boot has taken many forms in various places and times. Common varieties include the Spanish boot, sometimes referred to as scarfines, and the Malay boot. One type was made of 4 pieces of narrow wooden board nailed together. The boards were measured to fit the victim's leg. Once the leg was enclosed, wedges would be hammered between the boards, creating pressure. The pressure would be increased until the victim confessed or lost consciousness. The Roman candle. The Roman candle, from which the popular firework allegedly derives its name, was originally a torture mechanism whereby Christians were set ablaze for the amusement of the Emperor Nero. In the year 64 of the Common Era, the Great Fire of Rome devastated large parts of the imperial city. Facing blame for both causing the blaze and providing inadequate response to the inferno, which caused widespread damage to 10 of Rome's 14 districts, Emperor Nero blamed the fiery outbreak on religious minorities, including early Christians. Among the alleged cruelties bestowed upon these religious minorities was the so-called Roman candle. Using humans are the base substance akin to the wax foundations of a candle. These victims were tied to the stakes in the imperial garden for the amusement of the deranged emperor. There, the prisoners suffered being coated in pitch, oil, and other flammable substances before being set alight. The ultimately fatal fires were started from the feet in order to prolong the suffering for those condemned. It has been suggested, without corroboration, that these candles were used as decoration during the formal parties held by Nero. This Nero sounded like a messed up guy. Nevertheless, the ancient Roman candles signify the first organized persecutions of Christians under the Romans. Today, the term Roman candle refers to a type of Chinese firework that became popular in Western Europe during the Italian Renaissance. The lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler was usually filled with molten lead, tar, boiling water or boiling oil. It was used to torture victims by dripping the contents onto their stomach or other body parts like the eyes. Using this device, the torturer would proceed to pour molten silver on the victim's eyes, which would result in agonizing pain and eventual death. A small ball on a handle. The sprinkler would be filled with molten lead or boiling oil, and then it would be used to dribble the smearing liquid onto the person's body. Usually this torture ended whenever the torturer felt like pouring molten silver into the victim's eyes, killing them. The victims would sit down on a chair, be tied by their hands and feet, and await their grisly fate. The church called this the holy water sprinkler, but there was nothing holy about it. There you have it, folks. Tortures from around the world. Okay, guys, there's been another video from Project Dark Knight, and don't forget, if you're into horror, you can show man some love, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.